I got excited about talking about a topic, only to realize later that the topic is way too difficult to talk about, and then to sort of fumble over myself in finding an angle that is actually useful. And but then it came to me, when it particularly comes to humanitarian ethics, I've had a sort of an interaction before, particularly when I worked in Holland in MSF in Amsterdam. Whenever there's like a gathering, a party, something of that sort, and someone asks me about my job, particularly like people who don't spend their days in an NGO or a humanitarian work setting, and for a while, when someone tells me to describe what's fascinating about my job, I tell them I have an ethicist on speed dial, and it's true. I used to talk quite regularly with Julian, an ethicist that was collaborating with MSF. And this is, I feel this is important in two ways. The first is the joke in the topic is that we're, it sounds weird that you need an ethicist on a regular basis, but it is normal because this is part of the job, is actually haggling with issues that have ethical implications. The second very important point is you need to think twice before you invite me to a party. The fact is, ethics as a conception and as a practice, as a way of understanding our place and what we do is quite fundamental to the practice of humanitarianism. And if I was to oversimplify it, it would be for two reasons. We have a unique situation in current professional settings, in a job you might do, of being in charge often of situations beyond what a single person should be in charge of, or what current professional standards demand. So, for example, if you were a physician in a hospital in a Western setting, you'd have a wide range of decisions that might influence the outcome for your patient. But there would be someone else who determines a lot of things. There will be the setting, the resources available, the allocation of the resources, the guidelines, the limitations, and all that will be decided by other people who will use a range of things, in statistical information, norms, legal boundaries, and so on, to give you a space in which to be able to act with your core expertise. Now, transform that medical person to a humanitarian field mission, and suddenly we are taken out from that comfortable zone of being able to function with our core expertise. Let me give you an example. Hospital. Let's say a hospital that treats severe malaria and malnutrition. You're a doctor there, and you're managing people more than you've ever managed in a hospital in a Western setting. And here I'm talking particularly about an expatriate humanitarian. You are deciding where the trucks get used, whether the Land Cruiser gets used to deliver samples or bring patients, where to allocate the time of the mobile clinic, whether we will invest in more beds in the ward that is overwhelmed, or more outreach with the very few people we have. All of those without any leverage of detailed knowledge. So two things become at risk here. One of them is the fundamental question of doing no harm, which is deemed as one of the main ideas of humanitarianism. So we do good, we do no harm, and the doing harm becomes a distinct possibility the more we wade into uncertainty and lack of checks and balances. The second one is an equally significant risk of finding the enemies of expectation and ability. As a humanitarian whose job is to save lives, to make a change, to, however you want, the inability to fulfill that duty has been seen, and many researchers and scholars and practitioners have talked about the moral injury that befalls humanitarians. The inability to do what you're supposed to do, actually sometimes they ending up doing something in direct opposition to what you're supposed to do are huge risks of harm. The two together have a distinct moral and ethical boundaries and necessities that govern them. So we have ethics. We have ethics and ethicists. We have people who will tell us how to think and what to think about. We have books about it. We have quite a bit of research. There is a problem, though, and the problem has always existed, but has, I would argue, started to materialize much more now with a wave of dissent that has created conditions of dissatisfaction among many in the humanitarian sector. So whether you have come across that as a calls to decolonize humanitarianism, or talking about the structural issues that affect people who work in humanitarian aid or people who are affected with it, whether you have come to see that through the insistent call for and failure to achieve any level of localization that is meaningful, whether it is a personal recognition of a privilege of an expatriate versus a national staff, or any of the means by which you may have found yourself in a place of sort of discord between what you want and expect humanitarianism to be and what ends up being able to achieve. That fundamental inability to fulfill the image that we have of our job is a moral rift that needs to be addressed. And for that, people have addressed it in multiple ways. One of them was to talk about practice. What should we or should we not do? Talk issues like the Sphere Handbook and the Sphere Project, for example, tries to solve the problem with setting standards. Others are by changing representation. So diversity and inclusion assumes that the lack of diversity of people from backgrounds where most of the humanitarian workers, as in the Global South, or humanitarian beneficiaries, and I say that intentionally despite my distaste for the word, represented in the conversation. Others approach it from discussing some of the foundations and how do we interpret them, and that has happened periodically in the humanitarian discourse. And only a couple of weeks ago, Professor Hellhorst and myself were in a panel that discussed quite enthusiastically whether the humanitarian principles in their current formulation still make sense or are understood appropriately. Today, I would like to argue that none of those would be feasible without re-examining the moral foundations of humanitarianism itself. And by humanitarianism, define the boundaries, I mean the current Western secular, mostly dominated by money coming from Western countries and mostly headquartered in the global North, humanitarianism. For a better description, there was a paper in 2003 by HPG, which described humanitarianism as either Dunantist or Wilsonian. The Dunantist is within the tradition of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So from my limited experience, I will talk about organizations like the Red Cross and MSF who are considered that Dunantist, that Dunantist approach. And the first thing I would argue is one of the biggest problems we face is that we talk about ethics in terms of practice rather than in terms of foundational convictions. What I mean by that is some of the biggest debates that were labeled ethical in my own personal experience were ones about, for example, we have limited amount of vaccines for rabies in Congo, and we have an outbreak of rabies. How do we allocate the very few available vaccines? And we sat and wrote a criteria, and we engaged an ethicist. Another is we're evacuating Somalia. There are long-term patients, tuberculosis patients, and we're leaving them without medicines. Can we leave medicines at the risk of resistance, or do we need to continue without leave for security reasons without leaving a course of treatment? That was resolved partially by discussing it from an ethics point of view. But I think there is a level deeper, and that level deeper goes to the foundation. And I'll argue a few problems. One of them is that we have ended up putting so much centrality on the concept of saving lives. Saving lives become a sort of a fetishized fixation of humanitarianism that sidelines many other things that are important. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Well, saving lives, what do I mean by fetishized? Every slogan in humanitarianism talks about saving lives, whether it's a funding thing, help us save lives, or slogans, saving lives, changing minds, or lives and dignity, or whatever. There's a life-saving aspect. You can't be humanitarian unless you're saving lives. This is actually supported by the categorization of the discipline. And Bornstein and Redfield wrote about what's the difference between humanitarianism and development. And their argument was humanitarianism is biological. It's about the immediate saving of lives, where development is economical and it's about eradicating poverty in the future. That is absolutely central. What's the problem? One of the problems is how you can go into an extreme that is undesirable. There was an event that has been a changing event in my career when I was talking to someone coming from the field, and they explained to me how they, an untreatable breast cancer patient in South Sudan, untreatable as in we couldn't provide surgery, but there wasn't surgery for that stage in the whole country, was sent home to die in dignity. And here I'm quoting. And when I asked about pain management that she was provided, the answer was none. And there's obviously no dignity in dying in severe pain. But, and that has pushed me towards years of working on palliative care and pain management and humanitarianism. But the conclusion on that level is we're so fixated on the life-saving aspect, which is important, by the way, but to the extent that I believe lives that are unsavable become insignificant in many cases. Now, on palliative care particularly, this has changed, and there's plenty of work that has happened on palliative care and pain management in humanitarian setting in the past 10 years, but it hasn't always been the case. This is where we end up preferring war surgeries over maternal health. This is where we gravitate towards the things that we can causally link to the life-saving rather than to any other aspect of providing healthcare. The other problem than fixating on life-saving is the very sort of ontological ethics of humanitarianism. And what is moral about humanitarianism in the first place? And here is a problematic area, because if you go back to the discourse over the past 50 or 60 years after the Second World War, one of the basic ideas is humanitarianism being an imperative, a right, an obligation that one feels in themselves to aiding other people. And this translates in so many pieces of work on humanitarianism. One of them that I will keep quoting all the time is the commentary on the humanitarian principles in 1979 by Jean Pictet of the ICRC, who explained to us what do those mean. And the meeting we've had a couple of weeks ago was arguing on whether neutrality in its conception is still valid or not. And the problem is, I think, that you have many more issues that are actually as problematic. And here's one of them. Jean Pictet wrote in that one cannot be at one and the same time the champion of justice and charity. One must choose, and the ICRC has long since chosen to be the defender of charity. Now, this is a problematic statement. Who said that one cannot be the champion of justice and charity? And if that's the case, who are we to have chosen on behalf of everybody else that charity is more important than justice? Jean Pictet, or a defender of his position, might argue, you know what, we choose that because we are providing that aid, and someone else might choose differently. And that's fair, why not? It's actually not fair, I was being sarcastic. The choice is problematic in a couple of ways. The voice that Jean Pictet gets, and still gets, 40 years after that text, is bigger than the voice that almost any person from an affected community or a local organization will ever get in their lives. And that's not because of the size of the genius of Jean Pictet, and he was a significantly informed and important person in the development of humanitarianism, but because of the context in which he gets a voice. And that context, if I was to stretch it, is available to a white middle-aged man from a bourgeoisie family in Geneva, and is never going to be available under the current circumstances for a person from an affected community or previously affected community or so on. The other thing is the choice of charity over justice, and we could go a little bit into that if we needed to, is problematic. We're working in conflict, and we've allowed, and here's where the ethical foundation comes, we've allowed ourselves to make a blanket choice on behalf of everybody that will ever be a victim of a conflict, that their life is more important than their justice, even if those people have put their lives in harm's way because they wanted justice. We have allowed ourselves to discard their desire in that equation, if it was indeed an equation, towards a framework or a moral framework that we've decided on their behalf. And that's not unique to 40-something years ago in the ICRC. If you go to the speech of Nobel Peace Prize winning speech of MSF, Dr. Orbensky, the president of MSF at the time, talked in similar terms, but he extended, as MSF, he one-upped the ICRC. The ICRC is apolitical, hence life-saving is this singular mission. MSF said, we are apolitical, but our outcomes are political. And part of the issue of the fetishization of life saving at the cost of everything else and making choices on other people's behalf from now until the end of time is that we have allowed ourselves to become a dominant choice in people's lives without asking them. There's a priori no need to ask people if we have decided what is the appropriate moral framework to address the whole of humanitarianism from. You could call that whatever you want. One of the ways to call it is paternalism. And paternalism has been argued in this context as, it's no different from your government deciding on your behalf almost everything you have around you. But the argument here is that, in most of the places that we have the privilege to have those conversations from at the current time, governments are at least in some way elected democratically. This is not the case for, hence there is a recourse to responding to a government's unpopular or unjust behavior. But the same government goes and provides charity somewhere else in the world, say the British government or the Dutch government in another country, and people do not have the same recourse that Dutch people or British people have to adjusting the behavior of that government. And this is where the paternalism stops being potentially benevolent and becomes invasive and problematic. So I've talked about the humanitarian principles, and I just will add a mention of the code of conduct, which is signed by almost all organizations in the Sphere Handbook. And there has been a couple of things that would make a linguist happy. One of them is we will respect culture and customs. And that's brilliant, excellent, except that we really don't, but that's fine. But then comes that we will endeavor to respect the culture, structure, and customs of the community. Note the contingency. We will endeavor. So there's a unless. After that, that is implicit. And it's not said, but the unless leaves us a chance to say, but you know, that bit of culture, custom, and structure is really incompatible with our mission, or with our convictions, or with our moral framework. So we can ignore it. So we leave a contingency. Note in medicine, in Western medicine, you don't say, I will endeavor to give my patients informed consent. That would be illegal. But in humanitarianism, we still use that I will endeavor to respect people I work with. And then there's another one, even better, which is ways shall be found to involve program beneficiaries in the management of relief aid. You know, the sense, the foundational sense of how nearly impossible that is. Like, ways shall be found. It's not simple. You put shall be and in a sentence it becomes profound. Well, you know what? You can just give them the management of stuff. You don't need to shall find ways. But that's not easy, as we've heard repeatedly in big events like the 2015 Humanitarian Summit. Everybody talked about localization, but localization is extremely difficult because we need to find ways to guarantee that, you know, doesn't really go wrong. How would it go wrong? Because, you know, what if they did something that is not appropriate? What if they were corrupt? What if they wasted the money? And the same questions are never asked systematically and categorically about Western NGOs. And this is the crux of the matter. Before that, years before, there was arguments after the tsunami about cash being an appropriate way of humanitarian aid. Instead of us going somewhere else outside the country and buying them toilet paper or, you know, kind of milk powder that they never know or use, or food that is inappropriate, or, you know, how about to give them cash? You know, revolutionary idea. It ended up being the case, and now it's accepted after a systematic review of these. But for years, there was, you know, what if they wasted it on like alcohol or, you know, prostitutes or whatever? What if, and we agonized about, you know, should we give it to the women? What if we, you know, put the women in risk if they give them the cash? What if we give it to men? And those questions are never asked. Now, with all the economic support in COVID in Western countries, those questions are not asked systematically. And this is the crux of the matter. We have used what seems like, what sounds like sound moral principles to enforce a status quo that doesn't afford people we serve the same autonomy or capacity or competence or even humanity that we assume in ourselves. This is subtly or not so subtly enforced in the, you know, humanitarian beneficiary dichotomy. We're humanitarians, we're good by definition. We make mistakes, but that's fine. And then we define the people we serve by the one attribute of them that is fleeting and transient. Their need for aid is not fundamental to them. You know, we don't call ourselves like the entertained because we watch Netflix a couple of hours a day. We don't call, we're still humans, we're still people. We don't call ourselves the hungries because we go to a restaurant, but they are called the beneficiaries for days, for years, for decades sometimes, because they benefit in part of their lives from, and this is where an ethics that comes from sources that are foreign to people and that are based on a whole set of historical bases that are inappropriate become problematic. I'll finish on a note. What I mean by historically inappropriate is twofold. One is this historical denialism allows us to pretend like the whole of the humanitarian crisis is accidental. Haiti had an earthquake, they got screwed. But they got screwed because they've spent 150 years compensating France for their independence, paying back the price of their bodies that got liberated in 1802. That's why they got screwed. West Africa had civil wars because they were occupied. Congo didn't accidentally descend into chaos. Syria, as part of the Levant, doesn't accidentally has, borders drawn by razor sharp lines. All of those are historically contingent issues that are causing those. And that's historical, but there is another history being written now. The allowing climate change, the climate crisis, and the injustices like the vaccine apartheid that are happening now to pass by humanitarianism while still being apolitical and unengaged, because that's not our business, is going to put us in 10 or 15 or 20 years in a circumstance where all those become histories that are irrelevant and we go into the cycle again. The second thing is the source of our humanitarian ethics and principles are distinctly Western. And I'm not going to elaborate on that a lot, but there is a whole school of thought. And I, my intellectual guide in that is Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Ramon Grossfogel, who talk about the reason we today consider the only things that are universal are the intellectual product of white old men from 5 countries in Europe, well, and the US. While everything else, all the knowledge of the world is tribal or ethnic or, maybe sounds okay. But the only things that apply to the whole of humanity is the intellectual interpretation of those white old guys from those countries of Greeks 2,000 years ago. And we're stuck there. And maybe it is time for us, given that we are in humanitarianism at that point, to spare people we serve the harm that might cause by that foundational problem, and ourselves the moral injury of not being able to achieve or being a sort of a pawn in the status quo that we live in today. That we allow for that re-examination to be guided and led by different views of the world, by different ways of seeing, and potentially by a different humanitarianism that emerges from the ranks of humanitarianism, of today's humanitarianism, not from its top. Thank you very much.